Good afternoon, grade 12s. Once again, we are about to start with our topic 6. Our topic 6 is what we normally find in paper 2. It is the last essay question of paper 2. Now, it's important to understand that topic 6, the focus is primarily on end of the Cold War, Gorbachev's reforms in the USSR and the turning point in South Africa. So the point that you'll be looking at, we are looking at the exam guidelines first and the focus points. So the focus points that we are focusing on is Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union, the disintegration of the Soviet Union itself, turning point in South Africa, the collapse of the Soviet Union, how it impacts on South African politics. So what we have done now, we have discussed the exam guidelines and the focus points. So those three focus points and exam guidelines is what the question would be posed to you as a grade 12 learner. Then our introduction to the topic is the reforms in the Soviet Union contributed to the turning point in South Africa. Now, our introduction was how did Gorbachev's reforms influence politics in South Africa? When we look at the background quickly, how it was situated, when Gorbachev became the leader, take note, the leader of the USSR in 1985, the USSR economy was on the verge. The economy was on the verge of collapse. Very important that we understand that. He decided to withdraw from the Afghanistan war within 4 years. The war was causing USSR a lot of money. He also introduced two new policies, Glasnost and Perestroika. Now, it's important that when we look at the word USSR, all right, that's an abbreviation for the USSR. So when we move over now to Glasnost and Perestroika, we need to understand that how did Gorbachev introduce these reforms? Very important. When Gorbachev became the leader of the USSR, the economy was on collapse. For that reason, he had to introduce Glasnost and Perestroika. He decided to withdraw from the war in Afghanistan. Why? Because it was too costly. Then he introduced the two policies. Then let's look quickly at the meaning of Glasnost. Glasnost, what is the meaning of Glasnost? It means openness, transparency, freedom to express yourself. So the Russian people would be allowed to speak freely, freedom of speech. They could criticize the government at the same time, and also the Russian people would have freedom of speech. It means they can say and they can do whatever they want to because there was more openness with Glasnost. Many political prisoners were released. Take note, many political prisoners were released. Then let's quickly look at Perestroika. Now, what was the meaning of Perestroika? It's imperative that we understand, grade 12s, that Perestroika had to be introduced because the economy of Russia was about to collapse. And because of that, they introduced Perestroika. So the meaning of Perestroika was to reform the communist system. It means now that Russia would no longer be a communist country, meaning that Russia would now move to a system which allows profit making within Russia. Then the next point, private businesses were allowed to make their own decisions about prices, take note about the prices, production and marketing. So when we look at the system that was about to introduce Perestroika, it reminds us about capitalism. So it means now that these were signs that Russia is now moving from communism over to capitalism. Then business could also get loans from the state. So it means now that Russia introduced these two reforms to bring changes within Russia itself. Then the impact of reforms on USSR. Bankrupt state-owned businesses, take note, bankrupt state-owned businesses was no longer receiving support from the state. And they were closed down. Investments were encouraged. More money was still spent on armaments. So when we look at the word armaments, grade 12s, the word armaments refers to weapons. It means any type of weapons that was used when you go into warfare. So armaments, very important, because some of the learners do not understand the word armament. So when you look at the word armaments, it speaks about any type of weapon going into warfare. Then the arms race had become too much to the USSR and had led to her bankruptcy. So it means now that because of the arms race, which had led to bankruptcy. So the reason for the reforms was because of the impact the country found themselves in. Then, now let's look at the collapse of the USSR and its impact on South Africa. But before we look at the collapse of the USSR and its impact, it's important to understand how did the collapse occur. We all understand that after Gorbachev introduced glasnost and perestroika, it's imperative that we need to have this in mind, that these reforms brought uprisings, which we could call revolts, within the satellite states in itself also. So when the satellites came into revolt, in uprisings, it all started in Poland. So when it started off in Poland, it was enforced, it was propelled by the Solidarity trade unions. So they propelled these reforms, these uprisings within Poland. And after they propelled it, now the uprisings now spread from Poland, it spread to Hungary. From Hungary, it spread to the other parts of the satellite states. Then it eventually ended up in East Germany. So in East Germany, Gunther, he made an announcement on 9th of February by announcing that new travel regulations would be introduced. By him introducing those new travel regulations, this is what happened. The people from East Germany decided to march towards the wall, now the Berlin Wall, and as they came towards the wall, they started demolishing the wall and they started to move into West Berlin. So it's imperative to understand that because of 9th November 1990, because of the travel regulations, they started to demolish the Berlin Wall. And when they started to demolish the Berlin Wall, it's imperative that we need to understand, because that signified now the end of communism within Russia, and also it also signified the end of the Cold War between USA and USSR. So when we move to our next slide here, it says the collapse of the USSR and its impact on SA. So now we need to understand now that Russia is on the brink of collapsing. Communism is ending within Russia, and the Cold War is about to end at the same time. Then the end of communism in USSR had a serious impact on South Africa. Take note. Had a serious impact on South Africa. The National Party had established a minority government, introduced discriminatory laws against non-white people, which was a system called apartheid laws. It remained in power for 46 years through the support of capital investments by USA, Britain, and France. Now the question comes, why did USA, Britain, and France support this whole process that was happening within South Africa? The reason why USA, Britain, and France had to support the National Party with investments, it's because it was to stop the spread of communism. We need to understand that USA, Britain, and France, they were classified as the West. Russia was classified as the East. So in order to stop the spread of communism within Africa, they had to invest in the National Party. And for that reason, they had to invest in it. So what was the impact on South Africa? Now, it's imperative to understand also that before we go to the impact on South Africa, that in 1985, P.W. Botha made a famous speech, which was called the Rubicon speech. Now, the Rubicon speech, everyone thought that P.W. Botha would introduce reforms, changes within South Africa with regards to apartheid, but it was not so. Because when he started off with his speech, he said to the people, to the crowd, to the media, everyone that was present during his speech, he said there would be no reforms with regards to apartheid in South Africa. So what did that do to the current situation within South Africa in 1985? It had a disastrous effect on the economy of South Africa, first of all, and second of all, it economically impacted South Africa negatively. So when we look at the impact on South Africa, the Western countries now, after the Rubicon speech, the Western countries wanted to ensure that USSR did not get control of the mineral resources and the strategic sea route. Why strategic sea route? It brings us back to when Jan van Riebeeck came to Africa. So the Cape Point was a strategic sea route to the east. Then they saw SA as an important anti-communism ally. Like I explained to you guys that the battle continued before 1989. The battle continued between communism and capitalism. When members of the UN, the United Nations, called for economic sanctions against South Africa, USA, under the leadership of President Reagan, and Britain, under the leadership of Margaret Thatcher, opposed the sanctions. But very imperative that Congress force Reagan to introduce sanctions. The same with Margaret Thatcher also. But these two leaders were opposing sanctions against South Africa. Then further impact on South Africa, which is very important that we understand that part. That the further impact on South Africa is in the 1980s, the South African government faced a changed world order, meaning that things was changing within the world. What was changing within the world? The African continent was no longer controlled by Europeans. It means now, in the 1980s, as Africa moved into the 1980s, it meant that no African country were controlled by no European country, meaning that all the African countries had their independence. Then, South Africa became isolated. Anti-apartheid organizations, take note, anti-apartheid organizations in Western countries were able to put pressure on the governments to introduce economic sanctions. So, in the 1980s, very important that we understand this part. The South African government faced a changed world order. Why? Because the African continent was no longer controlled by Europeans, and South Africa find themselves isolated. Why? Because they were now the only country in Africa that was still practicing the system of segregation, the system of apartheid. So the anti-apartheid movements in Western countries were able to put pressure on their governments, like in Ireland, like in England. Those anti-apartheid organizations were putting pressure on their government to impose sanctions against South Africa. Then the impact continues. The impact continues by major international banks, the IMF, Barclays Bank, take note, demanded immediate payment of their loans and refused to renew loans. 250 foreign countries, take note, 250 foreign companies withdrew from South Africa. Examples are Pepsi, IBM, Peugeot, Mobile, which is not on the screen here. Then the growth rate in 1982 was less than 1% in South Africa. This led to high unemployment. So now we can see from the 1980s, unemployment was a big issue within South Africa. So unemployment, when we look at it, it is not something new that, now that is occurring currently that we are finding ourselves in. Then, when we move now to the next slide, the collapse of the USSR. Take note, the collapse of the USSR also affected the ANC. All right. Now, why did it affect the ANC? It's imperative to understand that the USSR supported the ANC financially and with military training, and they also provided the basic necessities to them. Then, when we go to our next point, it emphasizes what I said here. The Soviet Union had supported the liberation movement. Now, who do we classify as the liberation movement? It was the ANC. And they were in exile. Take note, exile. When you look at the word exile, the word exile means you are a political threat to who? You are a political threat in your country, and for that reason, you run away to another country. It means now that you are running from your country and you're moving to another country because politically you are a threat. So now you are classified as an exile. So exile with weapons, military training, and financial aid. The ANC had lost a benefactory. Take note, the ANC had lost a benefactory. So when we look at the word benefactory, it means the ANC lost someone very important to them. Why? Because, and was ready to negotiate. Because of the loss of the Soviet Union, the ANC was ready to negotiate. International community had expelled South Africa from all major sporting organizations. Example, FIFA. So when we think about FIFA, we think about the World Cup, Olympics, Commonwealth Games, and IRB. So when we look at Commonwealth Games, Commonwealth, those are the countries that were colonized by Britain. So this is why we have Commonwealth Games. Then, the pressure on the National Party. What happened is, in 1975, Angola received the independence from Portugal. So when Angola received the independence from Portugal, within Angola itself, there was an organization called MPLA, UNITA. And these two organizations, MPLA, they were more communist. UNITA, they were more capitalist, meaning there was a civil war that started between the two, who should control Angola. So what happened with regards to Angola, it's important that because that situation put a lot of pressure on South Africa. This is why we have on our slides, these actions place pressure on who? The National Party. Cuto Kanavala and the impact it had on South Africa. The battle, take note, the Battle of Cuto Kanavala, take note, it happened in Angola. It started in 1987 when South Africa was defeated by combined forces. Take note, combined forces of Cubans and MPLA. And this was a turning point within South Africa. Because what happened on that day is that as the Cubans were pushing UNITA and the South African Defense Force back into the northern part of Namibia, they realized something, that the people in the United States, they decided, listen here, we need to go to the UN and we need to try and sort this thing out. So the USA, Cubans, South Africans, and also part officials of the ANC, they decided, now listen here, let's sit down and let's come to a resolution. So after the Battle of Cuto Kanavala, this is what happened. They signed a resolution of 435, which gave Namibia their independence. So when we look at our last point here, the National Party government was forced, take note, was forced to reassess its military strength. Meaning now that the National Party realized they could not fight the ANC physically anymore. Why? Because the ANC had no support from USSR anymore. The USA, Britain, they would draw their support towards the National Party. So meaning now, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the ending of communism in Russia, the ending of the Cold War, what did that do? It forced the National Party now to say, listen here, we cannot use communism as a phobia against the ANC anymore. So we cannot call the ANC terrorists anymore. We cannot call them communists anymore, because why? The communist country is no longer supporting them. Then, so that in itself placed immense pressure on who? On the National Party and on the ANC. Because at this point in time now, the ANC, financially, they had no support, because their major role player that supported them with armaments and with finances could no longer sustain them. Then it agreed to withdraw from Angola. Who agreed to withdraw from Angola? The South African Defence Force. And they started to negotiate a settlement over Southwest Africa. And it was a revolution 435. So it's imperative that we understand that Southwest Africa, how did South Africa gain control of Southwest Africa? During World War I, South Africa defeated the Germans in Africa, and the League of Nations rewarded South Africa with Southwest Africa, and they named it Southwest Africa. So if you were a South African, there was no need for you to have a passport to go to Southwest Africa, because why? It was now part and parcel of South Africa at the very same time. Then we need to understand now that after the defeat at Cuto Kanavala, this is what happened now. They renegotiated Southwest Africa, and they renamed it Namibia. So after the resolution of 435, Namibia received now their independence. But there was still pressure on the National Party. Take note, the pressure was not only on the National Party, but the pressure was also on the ANC. Then the pressure was the peaceful negotiations in Namibia encouraged both the National Party and the ANC to do what? To start with a negotiating process. So that's imperative that we understand that part. So all the pressure that mounted on them, it initially started way before 1989, but 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that now enhanced the negotiating process. The national government saw that the majority rule did not necessarily mean communism. So what the National Party realized is that the majority rule did not mean that communism will take over South Africa. Then, this is now what happened now to F.W. de Klerk and the changes that was introduced. In 1989, in the early years of 1989, P.W. Botha suffered a stroke. He was the president of South Africa. He suffered a stroke, and after he suffered a stroke, uh, this is what actually happened now. F.W. de Klerk became now the new leader within South Africa in 1989. But it is imperative to understand that during this time, the National Party was divided into two factions, into two sections, meaning that the National Party was divided into the conservatives and into the liberals. So when we look at the word conservatives, conservative means people that don't want to change. So within the National Party, there was a group that didn't want to bring change with regards to the system of apartheid. Then there was another group called the Liberals. The Liberals, they were under the guidance of F.W. de Klerk. So when P.W. Botha suffered his second stroke, automatically, this is what actually happened now, that F.W. de Klerk was now pushed into the position of becoming president. So it's imperative to understand how F.W. de Klerk actually moved into the position of becoming a president. But at the same time, this was happening in 1989. So 1989 had a significant impact on South Africa as a country and on the world at the same time. Because after they demolished the Berlin Wall, like I said earlier, it signified what? The end of communism in Russia. It ended the fight of the Cold War between who? Between USSR and USA, meaning it ended the fight between the East and the West. So that now left the USA as a supreme superpower. It means now communism was controlling the world at 1989. So meaning now, because of the stroke of P.W. Botha, the fall of communism, the end of the Cold War, it forced now the National Party and the ANC to start the negotiating process to change South Africa and move it into a true democratic country. But F.W. de Klerk had this within mind. He realized that, listen here, we cannot use Moscow as a phobia against the ANC. So when we speak about Moscow as a phobia against the ANC, Moscow, the capital of Russia, meaning that Russia was classified as a communist country, meaning that communism has been abolished. It meant now that F.W. de Klerk had to start negotiating with the ANC now. So on the 2nd of February, 1990, de Klerk made his famous speech in which he announced the following. Please take note, which he announced the following. He said, they will unban the ANC PAC, meaning they will unban all political organizations. Then they will also release Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners. So with that in mind, it's imperative to understand that this happened on the 2nd of February and it was classified as his famous speech. The speech was followed, take note, the speech was followed by democratic and peaceful negotiations. So before I continue with democratic and peaceful negotiations, it's imperative to understand, grade 12s, that on the 2nd of February, de Klerk announced that he will release Nelson Mandela and all other political prisoners. But in 1989, political prisoners were also released. Political prisoners in the sense of Walter Sisulu. So with Walter Sisulu, other prisoners were also released with him. But 2nd February, he announced again that he will unban all political parties. He will release Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners also. So after the release of Nelson Mandela, now this is what happens normally is that sometimes people forget the day when he was released. Nelson Mandela was released on the 11th of February 1990 on a Sunday, and he was released from Victor Verster prison in Cape Town. Then, so when we look at the negotiations, it says the speech was followed by democratic and peaceful negotiations. So when we look at peaceful negotiations, it was not so peaceful as you would classify, but it was not so violent also as we would classify. There were violence, but it was the violence, it was controlled, it was calmed in a way by the South African security forces within South Africa. But we need to understand it was not so peaceful. But the reason why we're using the word peaceful here is because South Africa was not involved in a civil war. And for that reason, we could say that it was a peaceful negotiating process within South Africa, although there were a little bit of violence between certain factions within South Africa as a country at large. But let's go quickly to Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela would play a leading role with regards to the negotiating process within South Africa. So it is imperative, grade 12s, that we understand now that this, what we're dealing with here, this is called Gorbachev's reforms and how it impacted on South African politics. It means now that South Africa had a change. Why? Because of the impact that the reforms of Gorbachev had on South Africa. But I just want to go back quickly. So it is imperative to understand that Glasnost, Perestroika, these were the two policies that were introduced. But before 1985, before Gorbachev became the leader, Brezhnev was the leader. And Brezhnev had also a policy, all right? So it's imperative that we understand that these Glasnost and Perestroika, they were called Gorbachev's policies. So we must not get confused with Brezhnev's policy, which was called Detent, and Glasnost, which was policies that were introduced by Gorbachev. But Gorbachev also introduced another policy which was called democratization, where within the Communist Party they first had elections. So it's imperative that the focus for this question is Glasnost and Perestroika, and these were the policies. That means Glasnost was openness. Perestroika means reconstructing the economy of USSR. So it's important to understand that Perestroika was first introduced because the economy of Russia was about to collapse. At the same time, then they introduced Glasnost, meaning openness. Now, because of the openness, it brought about a sense of rebellion, a sense of stubbornness within the satellite states. And this is why, when we go to the exam guide says the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So when we speak about a disintegration of the Soviet Union, we need to understand that the Soviet Union had satellite states, and those satellite states were used as a buffer in front of the USSR. So they disintegrated because of the reforms that were introduced. But we need to understand that after the reforms, Soviet Union were desegregated now. It means they were it means they were dismantled now. So after being dismantled now, it had impact on South Africa. Very important now. South Africa found themselves in a new world order where communism has ended. There is no fight against communism anymore. The African continent was no longer controlled by Europeans, meaning all African countries had their independence. Then South Africa became isolated. Anti-apartheid organizations in Western countries were able to put pressure on the governments to introduce economic sanctions. Then a further impact from the outside world now. Major international banks, IMF and Barclays, demanded immediate payment of their loans and refused to renew loans. 250 foreign companies withdrew from SA. Examples, Pepsi, IBM, and Peugeot. The growth rate in 1982 was less than 1%. This led to the high unemployment rate in South Africa. The impact continues. The collapse of the USSR also affected the ANC. The Soviet Union had supported the liberation movement, the ANC, members which were in exile with weapons, military training, and financial assistance. The ANC had lost a benefactor and was ready to negotiate. International community had expelled South Africa from all major sporting events, the World Cup, Olympics, Commonwealth Games, and the rugby also. Then the pressure that was put on the National Party first. It was the battle at Cuito Canaveral. The battle at Cuito Canaveral in Angola in 1987, when SA was defeated by the combined forces of Cubans and MPLA. I explained to you MPLA, they were the leading party that was in favor of communism. In fact, they were classified as a communist party also. Then the National Party government was forced to reassess its military strength, meaning that the National Party realized we could not physically fight the ANC. It means we need to sit down around the table and we need to start negotiating. Then pressure on who? On the National Party and the ANC. So we must understand there was first pressure. The Cuito Canaveral battle actually put pressure on who? On the National Party, forcing them, listen here, you need to sit around the table with the ANC and you need to start to negotiate. Then the pressure now shifted from the National Party, and the ANC was included here now. It agreed to withdraw from Angola, the National Party, and negotiated a settlement over Southwest Africa, Namibia, meaning Namibia received the independence in 1989. The peaceful negotiations in Namibia encouraged both the National Party and ANC. The National Party government saw that majority rule did not necessarily mean communism. Then de Klerk brought in changes. On the 2nd of February 1990, de Klerk made his famous speech in which he announced where he decided to unban all political parties, meaning ANC and PAC. At the same time, he said, you will release Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners. The speech was followed by a democratic and peaceful negotiating process. Grade 12s. So that in itself now, that now would end now our topic basically. So what's important here is that we need to understand that because of the reforms within Russia, it impacted South Africa politically. It means it brought a change to South Africa, it brought the end to the apartheid system within South Africa, and that now, if you look nicely now, the ending of this essay, all right, it's our introduction to the road to democracy now. Because when we look at the road to democracy, it speaks about the negotiating process. All right? So it's imperative that we understand that question 6 is actually the start that links us now to the road to democracy. But before I conclude, I would just like to read a quote from our former president, Nelson Mandela. It says, "It is in your hands to create a better world for all who live in it." So grade 12s, with that thought in mind, I hope that you have enjoyed the lesson. I hope you will have a better understanding how to formulate, how to structure your essay. It is also important that we need to understand that you must have introduction, content, and conclusion. So by me standing here, I have given you the content. It means I have presented the topic to you. And by presenting the topic to you, it means that you can formulate now your question based upon the question that's being posed to you. Grade 12s, thank you for listening to me. Stay safe, stay indoors, and continue to study. Thank you.